Here we go. I am so excited to welcome our author for the evening, Dr. Diana Hill. Dr. Diana Hill, PhD, is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Santa Barbara, where she provides therapy, high-performance coaching, and training to mental health professionals in ACT. She is a co-host of the popular podcast, Psychologists Off the Clock, which has over 1 million downloads, where she has interviewed leaders in the field of psychology, mindfulness, and wellness. She is a regular teacher for the Mindful Heart program in Inside LA. And she's passionate about integrative health, homesteading, and parenting with intention. She is the co-author of this book with Debbie Sorensen of the New Harbinger Publications book, ACT Journal, How to Get Unstuck and Live Fully with Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Learn more about her at drdianahill.com, but tonight you get to hear and see her live. So please welcome Dr. Diana Hill.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Hello. And joining her tonight is Dr. Megan Donahue. Dr. Donahue is a licensed psychologist and the past president of the Santa Barbara County Psychological Association. She came to Santa Barbara for graduate school at UCSB, earning a doctorate in clinical counseling and school psychology, and hopes to never leave. She works at Crane Country Day School in Montecito and has a small private practice specializing in childhood anxiety and OCD treatment. We are very pleased to have Dr. Megan Donahue on this program. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, take it away.
All right. Good to see you, Diana.
Hi, good to see you, Megan. Yeah.
I wanted to start with, why did you write this book? And
Yeah, well, it's co-authored with a good friend of mine, and we were really friends first, Dr. Debbie Sorensen. And it sort of goes back in time to a group of psychologists that were together at a sort of like a girls' weekend retreat. And we were talking about psychology and our ideas about how we apply the concepts that we learn in our training, but also in our clinical practice to our own personal lives. And on that retreat, I remember one of us saying, wouldn't someone want to be a fly on the wall right now, hearing how these psychologists apply the practices in their parenting and in their work life and their own partnerships? And from there, that's where the podcast Psychologists Off the Clock was born. And really over time, Debbie and I just deepened our understanding of ACT and the application of ACT. And what we really found was that these principles, which have been so, there's a tremendous amount of evidence about them, and just sort of the evidence on ACT has been skyrocketing in the research world over the years. Although that's the case, there's not a lot of resources out there for the general public to use these principles from ACT. And then there's also just not a lot of resources for therapists that really break it down and make it applicable. So that's where the book was born, and it had many iterations over time to become what it became. But really, it started with friendship.
And I know our field, like many fields, love acronyms. Can you tell everyone tonight more about what is ACT?
Sure, and it's pronounced ACT, and it's so funny that the co-founders, who were Steve Hayes and Kelly Wilson and Kirk Strassel, who about almost over 20 years ago started developed this therapy, but now it's also considered a training. So it can be acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training. And this approach incorporates both sort of the behavioral science of psychology, so what we know from years and years of study of human behavior, in combination with some Eastern principles, things like acceptance and mindfulness or being present or perspective taking. And the approach is one that really addresses some of the key issues in human suffering, which is that human minds tend to avoid pain and seek out pleasure, and that we really have sort of almost like a modern day mismatch between the human mind and what our environment is presenting with us, because it works well if you're avoiding pain and seeking out pleasure, if you're in the in the wilderness and you're trying to survive for the night. But it doesn't work so well if your avoidance of pain is your social anxiety, and so you never go to an event, or you don't go to school because you have an avoidance of fear of failure, right? So ACT is really an evidence-based approach that incorporates these acceptance-based principles and these the behavioral science to help people live more fully and freely in their lives.
And I wanted to start with us kind of, as you heard in my introduction, that I am a big fan of our local community. And I wanted to maybe just start with an excerpt from the book that sort of illustrates what the book experience will be like for readers, but also connects us to some of the stories of Santa Barbara that lie between the covers.
Sure.
Like to start, and then I think we'll get into the specifics of some of the foundations of ACT.
Yeah. Well, just to say, I was just talking with Michael beforehand that he was born at St. Francis Hospital and I was born at Cottage, and I had one of my sons here at Cottage. And so Santa Barbara is definitely my hometown. And I couldn't help but write about Santa Barbara because I think for folks that live in Santa Barbara, we have a fond feelings about it. We kind of believe that we're in the best place in the world. So I did write about Santa Barbara, and this story actually, each chapter goes through 7 days where you practice different processes, and we can talk about those. But this story felt particularly timely for right now, and it's a story about perspective taking. And so I just did a little vignette at the beginning of the perspective taking chapter, which is called Perspective Taking, Take in the View. Summer mornings can get fogged in here in coastal Santa Barbara. Locals call it Gray May, June Bloom, and August Foggust. Tourists who pay lots of money for oceanfront views crawl back into bed disappointed when they wake up to drizzle. Meanwhile, locals are busy packing their beach bags and putting sunscreen on their kids. What locals know is that fog is temporary, and by most afternoons, it will have burned off to reveal big, clear skies. And I'm just going to read a little bit more to show you how that relates to the psychological concept. Our mind can be a bit like a tourist who's new to an area and doesn't know what to expect there. The fog of predetermined beliefs about ourselves and the world filters our experience and blocks a bigger view. We humans construct stories to understand the world and find our way of belonging in it. But when our stories are inflexible or when we can't see past them, they skew our experience. We defend our self-image at the cost of real connection with others, or build up our self-esteem at the cost of falling hard when we're deemed average. Humans yearn for connection and belonging, and our conceptualized self-stories prevent us from learning, experiencing intimacy, and seeing our part of a greater whole. And then I go on to talk about, what are the signs that you're caught in a self-story? And then the rest of the chapter is really about helping you get unstuck from rigid self-stories and be able to take in a grander view and more kind of like a vision of yourself as transcending this sort of small ego space. Yeah.
That's a wonderful inroad into some of the more specifics of what the book holds and what ACT can offer. And can you speak a little bit to what psychological flexibility is, and then the 6 core processes, which perspective taking being one of them, outlined in the book?
Sure. So psychological flexibility is sort of the goal of ACT. And what psychological flexibility means is it's your ability to stay present and stay open, to be able to take perspective on yourself and the world around you, to know what's important to you, and then to take committed action towards that so that you're moving in a direction that lines with the type of person that you want to be in the world. And what's interesting about psychological flexibility is that they have found that it's through research that it's really beneficial to be psychologically flexible in a lot of different areas. So for example, ACT is being used with Olympic athletes. It helps to be able to stay focused on your goals and your values when you're an athlete. ACT is also being used with chronic pain, anxiety, depression, insomnia, and with parents. And during COVID, what they found, actually, there was a whole special issue in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science that showed that folks that were more psychologically flexible, so able to stay present and aligned, tended to fare better during COVID. They had lower rates of anxiety and depression. They also were less impacted by the negative impact of social isolation, and were able to engage in better parenting practices with less spillover effects onto children. So it turns out these psychological flexibility and the 6 core processes that make it up, really what some psychologists like Steve Hayes are saying is that it's really maybe one of sort of our like superpowers, and that you can learn it and you can grow it and you can practice it. It's really a skill. So the 6 core processes, I was looking for my Rubik's Cube, but my kids might have taken it. I like to think of them like sides of a Rubik's Cube because like sides of Rubik's Cube, they kind of work together and they influence each other. So when you turn one side, it kind of turns the other. And the 6 core processes involved in psychological flexibility include being present. So sort of like the mindfulness that we've heard a lot about in psychology and wellness, but really being present where it matters most to you. Being able to take perspective on your self stories and also take the perspective of others, which is really core to things like empathy. Being able to step back a little bit from your thoughts and not take your thoughts as literally true. And that's something called cognitive diffusion in ACT. And what's interesting is that's a made up word. It's not even a real word. Every time I would write cognitive diffusion, it spell checks it for you and it says cognitive delusion, but it's cognitive diffusion, which is really just your ability to not take your thoughts as being literal truth, but to see them as just thoughts. It's a little bit of a different approach than other models of therapy with thoughts. And then we also have values, which are really personal and chosen, what's important to you, and getting some clarity around that. Acceptance is another core process in ACT, which is your ability, not necessarily you don't have to approve or like of something, but your ability to open up and allow and stay curious when difficult stuff shows up in our lives, especially underneath our own skin. And then finally, the 6th one is committed action, which is taking action towards what you care about and using some of the behavioral science of psychology to do that. So those are the 6 kind of sides of the Rubik's Cube that work together to build your psychological flexibility.
And can you talk a little bit about how you teach those in the book and just how a reader would experience those within the way the ACT Daily Journal is structured?
Sure. Well, we actually added in a 7th bonus. And Debbie and I were writing this book during the pandemic, and we're both moms and we both had our kids at home and we're both pulling our hair out. And so we started with self-compassion and compassion and intentional use of time and self-care. So the first chapter actually of the book, and each chapter is designed as a week. So each chapter has 7 days, and each day has a practice, a little story, a little writing prompt that's designed to be like 5 to 10 minutes of your time. Really simple to do, so that you can kind of build these skills in your daily life throughout this period of 8 weeks. But the first chapter we call Preparing the Ground, because we're both gardeners and we believe in, you got to enrich the soil before you plant anything in it. So the self-compassion chapter is really about, and compassion rather, is really about preparing the soil. And then each of the, for 6 following weeks, you go through each one of those processes. You spend a week on being present, a week on practicing acceptance, a week on values. You go through each one of those for a week. And then at the end, there's an integration chapter, which is really pulling it all together and then also starting to think about how not only is this going to benefit you, but ultimately what we're also interested in is how is this going to benefit others? Like, how is this going to spread and be the benefit of our communities that we live in and our planet as a whole?
Can you take us into one of those 6 core processes, perhaps building on the story you just read or choosing another chapter and just sort of giving a glimpse into what that process looks like through the daily journal?
Sure. So one of the story I just read was about perspective taking. So gosh, I think that's a good one. We could use more of that on our planet, right? And certainly right now, not only in the US, but also as a parent of 2 children, how to help them with perspective taking, conflict resolution. And perspective taking is an interesting one because it's really based on this idea that humans make mental models of things, that we make mental models of their world to try and make sense of it. And it's sort of what a lot of neuroscientists would say is that our brains are just basically lazy and they'll try and get whatever shortcut they can to get through life. And one of those shortcuts is making up stories about yourself and some belief systems. And the way that you can tell if you're caught in like a rigid self story is if you start to have sort of these statements like, I am this, I always this, I can't this, I never this. And what happens over time is when you develop these self stories, and oftentimes they develop like early on. I have self stories about myself that I developed like at 8, and I've held on to it for, many, many years. And when we have a self story about ourselves, it tends to develop like a confirmation bias. So we take in information that supports our self story, and we can't see the world beyond that self story. We become inflexible about it. It prevents us maybe from connecting with others. It prevents us from trying out things, even if it's a positive self story. So sometimes I'll work with college students that come back from like Ivy League schools, and they had the self story of I'm smart. And then they went away and they didn't succeed to the nth degree, and it just crashed their whole self-esteem and their whole being, right? So it's not only negative self-stories that we can get stuck in, but in that chapter, what we start to do is we unpack some of the self-stories that you may have that are inflexible and that may be pushing you around a little bit. And we also start to develop something called sky mind, which is being able to see that you are more than the stories that you create about yourself, that actually, just like a sky that has weather, that a weather system that passes through, right? No matter how bad that weather gets, it never can harm the sky, that we can also start to access more of sort of a sky essence of ourself that is more and bigger than the stories that our mind creates about us. So we develop a little bit of a sky mind, and then we also talk, this is where it gets kind of a little bit Eastern in the ACT approach. We talk more about this sort of transcendent self that is kind of zooming out and seeing yourself as transcending over time. Like if you imagine there's a timeline and you're sitting at one spot on the timeline, there's a you that existed before this moment in time, and there's a you that will exist in the future, and be able to take perspective on your own self as transcendent over time.
Thank you for that glimpse into some of where this book will take readers. And I guess I'm wondering what you're hoping readers will experience and gain from working through the daily journal.
Yeah, well, I think that sometimes when you're writing, at least what I've learned is, I don't remember who told me this, but you should think about your audience, like who's your person that you're writing to. And when I was writing it, I was really thinking about, in some ways, my clients that have influenced me and taught me so much over the years about what it means to be vulnerable and human, and also the courage it takes to live in this world. And so I guess my hopes are that it's just an offering that may help people deepen their understanding of themselves and what's important to them, free them up a little bit so that they're not so caught up in our minds, because our thoughts can just be really harsh sometimes and critical and in a hard place to be. And also just be able to adapt and be flexible so they can really pursue what's important to them, whatever that is, personally chosen by them, what's important to you. And it's interesting to kind of see how basically psychological inflexibility, so our avoidance strategies or our thoughts can get in the way. Our difficulty with being present can also get in the way of us living fully in our lives. And I see that more and more in our practice, and also just with the pace of living right now. So I guess my hope is that it will help people live more fully and free.
And I do want to just pause for a moment to encourage folks to be typing in your questions for the end of this presentation for Dr. Hill to answer once we get there, and don't hesitate to put them in as we go if things are coming to your mind. And for those on YouTube, you can email them to Chaucer's. As you were just speaking of that, I was reflecting on parts of the subtitle of the book in terms of what did it mean to you and to Dr. Sorensen in terms of getting unstuck and living fully?
Yeah, I think sometimes when people come to therapy, it's because they feel stuck. They feel stuck. They feel stuck in their relationships. They feel stuck in an addictive behavior. They feel stuck in their jobs. They feel stuck in their own selves, in their relationship with themselves, right? And so how do we get unstuck is a good question. And actually, my brother-in-law he designs robots, and he first designed military robots, and then later on, now he's designing like driverless cars. But I had a long conversation with him about robots one day when he was driving me to LAX, and he described how when he designed military robots, what his favorite button that he designed into them, or program he designed, was the get unstuck button. And what happens is if a robot gets stuck, like say they're in a tunnel and they can't get out, what they're supposed to do is every single behavior possible except for the behavior that they're engaging in. So they can do backflips, they can hit their heads against the wall, they can go up on, get up really big, get up really small. And in some ways, what happens when we're stuck is that we do the opposite. We keep on doing the same thing over and over that's keeping us stuck in attempts to get ourselves out. And so what I really like about ACT is that it's a real fresh perspective that offers some ideas that maybe you've never tried before, right? And that may help you get unstuck from some things, because often what's keeping us stuck is our experiential avoidance. In the book, we talk about something called the experiential avoidance roundabout. And that was in part based on the movie Chevy Chase's European Vacation, where Chevy Chase goes around and around and around that roundabout with his kids in the back. And he's like, look, kids, Big Ben. And by the end of that scene, he's just exhausted, right? And he's fuming and irritable and he's hating it, and he's still going around. And that's often the way that we feel when we're stuck. We're just going around and around and around. But in order to get out of the roundabout, you have to move over a lane, and you have to be uncomfortable, and you have to actually often move towards the very thing that you are avoiding and experience the discomfort of exiting. But once you exit, then you can go on any street you want in town. You're free to go. You're free to live fully in your life, right? So I think some of these processes, they work together in giving you a fresh way or fresh approach to your stuckness, whatever that stuckness is. And I would say just normalizing stuckness. That's just, we're all stuck sometimes, and that's normal and that's okay. And sometimes we need a helping hand and some fresh perspective on how to get out.
And hopefully more compassionate reprogramming than the robot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there another portion of the book you would like to share with us tonight?
I have another Santa Barbara story.
Excellent.
So this one comes from the section on values. And in the values section, we sort of identify and sort of define what values are. So values are not about pleasure, but they're more about meaning. Values are sort of a direction to head, as opposed to like a goal or an endpoint that you get to, that you can always be moving in the direction of your values at any point in time. And values are really ultimately personally and chosen by you. They're not shoulds, they're not morals, that they really come from deep inside, a yearning inside of yourself of what you care about and really how you want to be in the world. They're verbs and adverbs, there's qualities of action. So in this section on day 4, I write this story called A Place for Love to Go. Santa Barbara is known for its beaches, but also its wildfires. When I was 7, I remember my mom packing up the car with our dog and bird and driving us through smoke to a friend's house to watch the fires on TV. In 2017, it was my turn as a mom to pack up my family and make our way through the smoke to safety. We gave each kid a shoebox to fill with his most special things. The chickens had to stay. Driving away, I looked back at our house and knew that no matter what burned, my value of loving was coming with me. Have you ever had the experience of going about your life as usual, and then everything changed quickly because of a big and unexpected life event, such as a job change, a natural disaster, war, a death or an illness, a car accident or a pandemic? How did such an event change your perspective? Did it help you see what you love most in a new light? Most of the time, values boil down to love. You don't have to wait for an evacuation warning, a medical diagnosis, or losing a job to remind you of this. Instead, you can take action every day as if love is the thing that really matters. Today, you're going to explore the value of acting on love and create a few concrete reminders to add to your day. And so the first journal prompt that we offer is, what would you pack? Imagine you had to evacuate your home quickly. What important items would you pack up? What do these objects show you about what you love most? And how could you act on that love today? So that's another one that is sort of a Santa Barbara special. We got beaches, but we got fires too. So it's not all love and roses here in Santa Barbara.
Can you speak a little bit about some of the other values that ACT helps people to explore and identify?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of values, really, they're one way that I've been describing values recently is sort of like playing a guitar, and how there's many strings to a guitar. So the different strings can be like the domains of your life. Oftentimes when people come into therapy and we start talking about values, they'll say things like, I value my health, or I value my friendships, or I value my kids. And those are really domains that you live your values out in. So values are, how do you want to be in relationship to your health? If you were the type of person you want to be when you're at your best with your kids, and I were following you around with a video camera throughout the day, what would I be seeing you doing? How would you be acting? How would I hear you? And like a guitar, when a musician gets ready for a performance, they don't just go on and perform, they tune it first, right? So to tune a guitar, you play all the strings and then you listen in. And then you go string by string and make subtle adjustments, right? So values are really about tuning in to yourself, what feels or sounds sort of out of alignment, and then making adjustments to it with your behaviors and your actions so you get a little bit more in tune. And just like a musician and a guitar, guitars just sit around and they go out of tune, right? So it's normal and natural to go out of tune, to be out of tune with your values. There's no judgment about that. And also with musicians, we give them time to tune up. So before they perform, we say, take your time. It's going to sound better. We know that. Take whatever time you need. And so we can do that for ourselves. And my wish is actually that we do that for each other, that we give each other the space and time to tune in to our values and then tune up with our actions so that we can feel just a little bit more consistent with the type of person we want to be in the world.
You've spoken a little bit about your part of your role being as a parent, and I'm wondering, do you talk about ACT to your children?
Oh, my kids know way too much ACT.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. My poor children. Yes. My oldest son will go around and say things. I'm taking committed action. Yes. Yeah. So we talk about ACT and we use ACT in our family. You know, we do psychological flexibility training all the time with our kids. I hope it's okay. I think every psychologist does. They pull out the marshmallow test when they're 2, and then they go on to the future. But what's really interesting is that we do a lot of perspective taking, and doing a lot of perspective taking exercises. So perspective, your sense of self really develops as soon as you can start to tell the difference between me versus you, then versus now, and here versus there, right? When you start to see yourself as a separate entity, you know this, Megan, because you're the developed, you know all more about children and development than I do. But we do a lot of perspective taking with kids. So for example, at the dinner table, I will ask my children about, they'll talk about their day. And if they're talking about another child, well, then they, something that happened, will often say like, if you got behind his eyes, what do you think he was feeling? Or if you got behind his eyes, what do you think would have been like to hear that conversation or to hear that from you? And what's been interesting is just that type of perspective taking has really helped also with social justice and understanding. Just this last week, we did, we homeschool our kids, and we were doing our homeschool group, and we opened the group on the day of the anniversary of George Floyd's death. And I opened with a poem that was written by Black psychologist Jennifer Payne, that she wrote on the day after George Floyd's death about its impact on her. And it was incredibly powerful, emotional, painful poem. It's actually on the Psychologist Off the Clock podcast right now. Her reading it to music, powerful and painful. and our kids could receive it and could understand, because of we've been talking about these principles all year long, and prior to this year, these are conversations that we're having. So I don't know. I mean, I just really believe in that the social emotional health of our children is as important as the academic. I would say even more than, I don't know how much we learned in the writing and reading department this year, but we learned a lot about Black Lives Matter, and we learned a lot about perspective taking. And that is something that I think that they'll carry with them into their future.
And I know you've mentioned a bit about parenting being one of the things that ACT and the book will help people explore. I'm thinking of all the busy, overextended parents in my world, especially this year, and just kind of understanding exactly, what, how long each of these daily practices would take, and how to kind of prepare the ground as a parent, or, just as a working professional, whoever it may be, and head to Chaucer's, buy the book, and then what?
Yeah. So, we even write in the beginning, this is a book about psychological flexibility. So please be flexible with it. Please do not pick up the book and think that you have to do it every single day for the next 8 weeks, because you'll make it 2 weeks in and you'll give up on it. Right. And I was actually just talking to a client today who's like, I couldn't start your book because I'm not ready to commit to it. I was like, oh my gosh, treat it like a tarot card deck. Go like this, open it up, and that's your day. Do that. And then you can revisit it, because it really is, it's meant to be some of the days could be 3 to 5 minutes. They could be longer if you want to spend a longer time writing, if you really get into a concept and you want to journal on it more. But it's really meant to be built into daily life. And what we know about sort of behavioral psychology and change is that small habits, there's a researcher, BJ Fogg at Stanford, that talks about tiny habits. When your habit is really, really small, like tiny small, BJ Fogg talks about every time he went to the bathroom, he would do 2 push-ups. And then when that got really easy for him, he'd do 3, right? And then now he's up to 10 push-ups to however many times he goes to the bathroom a day. He's getting pretty strong, right? But you want to make your behavior change as small as possible, so that when your motivation wave, when that wave of motivation is at its nadir point, when it's low, you're able to still engage in it. So that's why we made the book tiny. And even in the committed action part of the book, where you're starting to make some behavior changes for yourself, we make those really tiny, and you build on them over time. Make it doable for yourself, because some days you're just exhausted and you don't want to. I learned from Tara Brach a long time ago. She made a commitment to meditate on a regular basis. And she said, the only way that I've been able to keep that commitment was to make my meditation count if it's 2 to 3 minutes long. And I think that is true, that it's about the consistency, but not about the amount that matters.
Is there anything about the book that we haven't gotten to yet that you wanted to share with our local community tonight? Or just
maybe I should do a tarot card.
I was gonna say,
this is a good one. I'll do a tarot card. I'll read a story from Debbie. I'll do one from Debbie. Okay, so this one's good. I like this one because Debbie is known to be, she's like the most friendly, kind person you've ever met in your life. And when we were writing the book together, her friendliness, we actually identified as a self story, that she's friendly. She's like, sometimes I don't feel so friendly. So this is, let's see what chapter on. This is the day 5 from closing off to opening up. So this is the acceptance chapter. And Debbie writes, one day in a parking lot, I opened my car door too far and it lightly bumped the car next to me. No damage was done, but a man who saw my mistake made a rude comment. I immediately felt angry, and hours later, I was still stewing. What a jerk. I just can't imagine Debbie ever saying that, because she wouldn't use that kind of language. I kept trying to let the experience go, but it was all I could think about. At some point, I realized that the real emotion I was feeling was embarrassment. I had made a careless mistake, and he saw me. When I turned toward my more vulnerable emotion of embarrassment, I finally got unstuck. We can feel vulnerable when opening ourselves to the emotions we've been trained not to feel. If you've received the message that certain emotions are scary or even signs of weakness, you might have learned to run away from them. Or maybe you turn your feelings outward, as Debbie did with the man in the parking lot, mistaking embarrassment for anger. That too is a form of avoiding emotions if you think you shouldn't feel emotions you think you shouldn't feel. Despite what society may have taught you, there can be a lot to gain by turning towards your emotions and sensations. Your emotions serve a purpose. They can provide you with information about your needs and motivate you to make changes. Emotions such as anger, sadness, and guilt maintain our social fabric and connection. Imagine how difficult it would be to connect with the person who had no emotion. Not accepting emotions has consequences. We punish ourselves for what we feel without even realizing it. We don't take risks. We live smaller, more painful lives. By opening up and getting curious about our inner world, we can better use our experience to navigate our outer world more effectively. Willingness and acceptance aren't just about purposely doing things that feel difficult. They also help us face our teams, and that was an acronym that they learned earlier, which are difficult thoughts, emotions, associations, memories, and sensations, when we're taking values-based action. So the journal prompt for this day is write about something unpleasant you've been closing yourself off to or running away from. What do you miss out on when you close yourself off? What emotions would you like to feel if you were to move? What emotions would you likely feel if you were to move toward and open up to this situation instead? And then the practice for the day. So every day has a practice. So you do a little writing and then you journal about it. And then the practice is today, notice your urge to close yourself off to unwanted inner experiences and situations. Instead, practice gently opening yourself to them. You can open with your body, gently contact the uncomfortable feeling and allow it with your body. You can open with your mind, imagining yourself saying yes to what is. And you can open with your behavior. Take an action that moves you towards what you care about, even if it's uncomfortable. The more you practice opening up, the more freedom you will experience.
I love how you, first of all, cringed a bit when I prompted you to share something else, but then immediately went into the practice of doing exactly what you were sharing, of this can be a tarot card deck. And I think that was such a glimpse into the depths of where the book will take us as we explore it.
Yeah, it takes some psychological flexibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I hope, I hope I'm ignoring my dog that is very, I apologize for muting. That's why I keep muting, because she is wanting to be a part of this conversation. But in these last few minutes, I was wondering if you could just speak to a few things we can start to do to prepare the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I've gotten really interested in compassion, I think in particular this year. And one of the folks that I've been reading quite a bit of is Paul Gilbert. And he's from the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and he writes about the flows of compassion. So the flows of compassion is our ability to give compassion, receive compassion from others, and give compassion to ourselves. And the word compassion is really this combination of both opening to pain and acknowledging pain, moving towards pain, and then doing something to alleviate it. And I think that if there's one thing that in healing from the pandemic and the second pandemic of racism this past year that we need, it's compassion towards ourselves, it's compassion for each other, and it's also the ability to take in, everything from just being at the grocery store and receiving the, sort of the kindness of another person's eyes, that's also very healing. And it's healing at the level of the nervous system. So our nervous system has been really kind of thrashed, right? We've been on high alert for a long time, and we need our bodies to come back down again, to feel safe again in our bodies and ourselves, so that we can open up and hopefully be able to begin to emerge. It's not going to be the same, but I think there's also an opportunity to have developed a greater understanding about ourselves and each other, and possibly some post-traumatic growth coming out of this pandemic.
I hope so as well. I'm wondering if it's a good time to open up to questions from our viewers and
Sure.
our listeners today.
Yeah, I don't see any.
Okay.
Someone ask a question. I know my mom's out there. Ask a question, Mom. Do your
There's a
daughter.
question from YouTube.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds like a great program. Anne writes, I'm going to buy the book tomorrow. But if we wanted to take it further, is there a network online where they could speak to somebody about ACT?
Great.
Where could they go?
Okay, good. Some resources. So I'll share with you some different resources. One is that they definitely can find, if you're looking for a therapist, an ACT therapist, a good place to go would be contextualscience.org. And if you do find a therapist, it'll be all ACT therapists in there. So if that's the specific thing that you want. I also do a lot of free teachings on ACT. And part of what happened for me during the pandemic, and many therapists felt this as well, is our practices got really full. And then all the therapists were looking for therapists. So there was no therapist to go to. So I started doing a lot of free offerings, and I have some really low cost trainings on ACT, and I'm going through some of these principles through Inside LA over the course of this next year. And then I also have some a free Tuesday teaching where it's more of a meditation, yoga, and some of the ACT principles that's done through Yoga Soup and Mindful Heart programs, which is a wonderful program developed by Radele Weininger. And so that's on Tuesday evenings. And so I would just recommend, if you want to go to my website, which is drdianahill.com, and go to the events page. I have a lot of information there that you can learn more. But I encourage you to look up a therapist if you're looking for one. And certainly in Santa Barbara, there are some therapists that are interested in ACT as well. And you can even go to Psychology Today and look for that as well.
And buy Radule's books, because she's a wonderful writer as well.
Yes, and she's coming out with another one soon. So stay tuned for that. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. I have a friend, we'll call him Micah, and he's a writer. How does one apply the ACT Daily Journal to creativity, such as something like writer's block or painter's block? How can one utilize your book to unstuck me, my friend?
Yeah. All of a sudden, I feel like I'm on that airplane ride next to the person that says, I have a cousin who, yeah. So actually what's interesting is that ACT is being used for procrastination as well. And writer's block is sort of another version of that, where sometimes we can get stuck because we care about something so much, right? And the way that ACT views pain is that pain and values are really sort of joined at the hip. They're connected, right? And sometimes we care so much about something, we're writing a book or we're working on an article or we're applying for a job, that it ends up being that we don't want to go towards it because it's uncomfortable to go into that space of discomfort of caring, and the possibility of what if I fail, or all the thoughts that can get in our head. That can be one of the things that can contribute to writer's block and to procrastination. So some of the ideas that we talk about in the book of helping you get unstuck from your sticky thoughts and get a little bit of space from them, as well as identifying the values that are underneath the why of why you want to write. And then freeing yourself up a little bit to be creative, like the tarot card thing that I just did with the book is really a psychological flexibility thing of just kind of, when I was a kid, my dad used to throw spaghetti at the wall to see if it was done. And like sometimes the spaghetti would stick and sometimes it would come off. And it's sort of like that. You just got to throw stuff at the wall and see if it sticks. And that takes some psychological flexibility and some willingness to like kind of let go a little bit and be a little bit messy.
Oh, nice. My friend thanks you.
Yes, very good.
Are there any questions out there besides? Okay, let me ask you this while we wait for a question. How are you able to apply that to your children, passing that on without having them go through the book? But you want them to go through the whole program, but you want to teach them in their own language. Yeah. How are you able to do that?
Yeah. So the best way to teach psychological flexibility to kids is to be a psychologically flexible parent. That kids learn a
Mm.
lot more from what you are doing and how you are living than anything that you tell them or teach them.
Mhm.
And so really, and that's what the research supports, is that there's actually really some rub off, parents that are more psychologically flexible are just they're gonna intervene in a different way. When my kids
Yeah.
are fighting in the back of the car, it's a choice point, right? Like I used to say there's no sound I'd want to hear less than the sound of my child crying. Now there's no sound I want to hear less than the sound of my children fighting. And so that's a point where I could shut down, get narrow, and I could yell, and that would stop them, right? I could pull over the
Mhm.
car and that would stop them, but it wouldn't really be teaching them about how to be psychologically flexible, right? And so I can
Mhm.
intervene, think about, okay, how could I use this as a teaching moment for myself? Like, how can I be psychologically flexible, get aligned with the type of parent that I want to be, tune into what's uncomfortable about this for me, and still continue to act in a way that's aligned with my values, right? And then when I do
Mhm.
that, I just demonstrated to them what to do with frustration. And then maybe they'll do that same thing when they're frustrated in another circumstance outside of the car, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's more about modeling, I think, than anything else. And
Mm.
what I really encourage for parents to do is like do the work on yourself first, and it will benefit many.
Mm. I do have a question for both of you as psychologists. Since we're opening up, things are looking better, with the COVID. Have you noticed a change in how you're treating your patients and how you're treating people now? Is it slightly different from what it was, let's say, 6 months ago?
Do you want to answer, Megan?
When you say how we're treating them, can you
Or,
more? Just
well, or how they're addressing what's going on around them, and how you are interacting with them as they make this transition from being locked up to suddenly having some kind of freedom now.
Diana, do you want to go? Because my dog is going crazy.
Yeah, sure.
Like flexibility right here.
Flexibility, yeah. Mute yourself. Yeah. So, what's been interesting about the opening up is that there's a lot of different reactions to it. And actually what I notice is that some folks are really realizing that there's things about the lockdown. There's things about the pandemic that they liked. It's a horrible, horrific thing, but there's things about the pandemic, about the lockdown aspect of the pandemic,
Mhm.
that they
Mhm.
realized certain ways of being that really worked for them, whether that's not going to every baby shower, or that's working from home and being able to walk their dog midday, or that's cooking more meals, or it's just having a little bit more for introverts. I think they actually really thrived during the pandemic. It was like, finally, I
Mhm.
have enough space. And then other things that people have learned about, just about themselves and what matters, and the busyness and what they don't want to allow back in. But as things are opening up, I'm actually hearing real apprehension about, wow, it's
Mhm.
just everything seems like it's going so fast, and I'm all of a sudden back into these things where I didn't want to be in. And that's where I think taking the time to slow down and take a look at, some of the questions that I've been asking my clients is, what did you learn from the pandemic about what matters to you? And how are you going to use what you learned to help you design the life as you exit the pandemic? And that you have some choices around that. And also it made us all a little bit more flexible in a lot of ways. I mean, I worked with clients
Mhm.
that were in their beds, in their bathrooms, and a lot of sessions in the car with folks.
Yeah.
And it's just
Mhm.
sort of like, we don't have to have it all together, and we don't have to have it all, perfect in the way that we often felt like we did before the pandemic.
Mm.
I would echo that it's definitely a range of responses. And as you were talking tonight, even Diana, and reading from the book, I think for different individuals, what is now what had been protective and helpful is now potentially an avoidance response. and trying to start to decode some of that, especially, but also I think giving space for what it is they've learned, or what are some of the reasons why they're wanting to continue living as they had been, like not being able to say no to things, being able to, not do everything. I think there's a lot of different layers that all of us are going to be sort of sifting through in these next few months and year, really. Diana,
Well,
I see your mom has chimed in.
Thanks, Mom.
And it relates to this.
She's my biggest supporter.
She wanted to, she's asked, it relates to our conversation we're having now. What encouragement can you give other parents who have been homeschooling in this difficult year?
One more week, it's almost over. Summertime, my friends. Just get through. No, I mean, I just, I think this year has been about surviving a pandemic. Congratulations. If you're listening to this, you made it. And I think that the parents were of the groups most affected mental health wise during the pandemic. The Generation Z actually was really negatively impacted by the pandemic, those in their 20s. The BIPOC community, very significantly impacted by the pandemic. Essential workers that had to go to work and be in that level of stress day in and day out. They didn't really have any way out, any option out. And parents of school-age children. So if you're feeling exhausted, you're feeling done, you're feeling like I haven't kept my life together and everything is kind of a mess. You should look at my house up there right now. It's a disaster zone in the making. There's probably a fort in the living room. And you also got through one of probably the hardest years that you could get through as a parent, with your kids at home and kids on Zoom and kindergartners in little squares and boxes on screens. And I hope that you are loving them and that you're loving yourself and you're giving yourself a bit of a break.
Well, that could be said for everyone. That's very wonderful. Thank you. So as we near the closing, is there anything you'd like to add, Dr. Hill?
No, just I thank you, Santa Barbara and Chaucer's and small bookstores. And wow, Chaucer's was sort of like the pandemic icon, right? Of the line outside the door and going in, and we'll always remember that experience of how much we valued being able to come to Chaucer's, and the work that you've done in keeping us safe and being able to have a place to come to get our books, and to really, that was for a lot of people, the support that they needed, when we're all home alone, get off of our technology and get into a book. And so just appreciate Chaucer's as a local bookstore, and also just thank you for hosting this. Well,
thank you. That was very kind of you to say, and thank you both for joining us. Everyone, please, Act Daily Journal. You can't have this one because this one's mine, but please come in and get it. And I appreciate you, Diana and Megan. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Megan, for doing this with me. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and have a nice evening.
Good night.
Good night.